I was standing barefoot on cold dirt when I finally understood that my family had not made a mistake. They had made a decision because the clearing we had left only 40 minutes earlier was empty in a way that felt deliberate. Not rushed, not panicked, but erased. The tents gone, the cooler gone, the car gone, even the folding chairs we had eaten lunch on. Gone as if someone had come back with a checklist and made sure nothing remained except me, my 8-year-old son Noah, and the sound of his breathing beginning to change beside me, shallow and uneven in a way every mother dreads because Noah has asthma, and the forest air was turning sharp as the sun slid behind the trees, and the first thing I reached for was his inhaler, the blue one I never let out of my sight, only to feel my stomach drop when my hand closed on nothing but an empty pocket. And that was when I saw the paper on the picnic table pinned down with a stone, heavy enough to keep it from blowing away, waiting for me like it had been placed there on purpose, and when I unfolded it my fingers started to shake because I recognized my mother Carol's handwriting immediately. Neat, controlled, careful, the same handwriting she used on birthday cards and church sign-up sheets, and it read, "You will be safer without us. This is for the best." And in that exact moment, with the forest suddenly too quiet, and my son beginning to cough behind me, something inside my chest cracked open because I realized they had not forgotten us. They had not gotten lost. They had not gone for help. They had walked away believing they would never have to see us again. Noah tugged at my sleeve and asked me why Grandma and Uncle Kyle left, and I could not answer him because I was staring at the edge of the clearing where tire tracks cut away from the main road and disappeared deeper into the trees. Not toward safety, not toward the ranger station, but away, and I understood with terrifying clarity that this was not negligence, this was intent, and my first instinct was not fear, it was calculation. Because I am a nursing assistant who has spent years in emergency rooms watching people survive things they should not have survived, and I knew that if I let myself break down even for a minute, my son would pay for it. So I swallowed the panic clawing up my throat and knelt in front of him, forcing my voice to stay steady, while his breathing whistled faintly, telling him we were going to take a walk and find help, even as my mind raced through everything we no longer had. No phone signal, no car, no food, no medication, no warm clothes. Nothing but the jacket I had tied around his shoulders and the knowledge that the temperature would drop fast once night came, and as I stood there trying to decide which direction to take, I noticed something else that made my blood run cold because the cooler had been taken, but the trash bag had not, and inside it were empty food wrappers from dinner the night before, which meant they had packed carefully. Not in a hurry, not arguing, not afraid, they had eaten cleaned up. Waited until they were sure we were gone, and then left us behind like an inconvenience they no longer wanted to manage. Noah's coughing worsened, and he pressed his forehead into my stomach, whispering that his chest hurt, and I wrapped my arms around him and felt how light he was, how small, and the thought hit me harder than any fear of the forest ever could. They did this, knowing he was sick. They did this knowing I would have to choose between chasing them and staying with my child, and they chose a place where no one would hear us if he stopped breathing. And that was the moment the story changed from a family conflict into something much darker, because as I lifted Noah into my arms and stepped out of the clearing, I knew that if we survived this, it would not be because they came back for us. It would be because they failed, and 10 days later, standing in a hospital room with federal agents at my bedside and a judge calling what they did a crime, I would finally understand that the forest was never the most dangerous part of this story. My family was. Before that day in the forest, I was not someone who thought of herself as a victim or even as unlucky because my life had taught me to lower expectations and keep moving, and at 31 years old, I had already learned how to survive quietly, how to show up for work, exhausted, and still do my job, how to smile for my son even when my back ached from lifting patients all night because I worked as a certified nursing assistant in a long-term care facility outside Spokane, pulling double shifts whenever I could get them, wiping down beds, changing sheets, holding hands when families did not come, and then driving home in the early morning light to wake Noah for school, pack his lunch, check his inhaler, and pretend that this was normal, that this was enough. because 2 years earlier my husband Mark had died in a construction accident when a faulty scaffold gave way and one phone call turned my life into something I never planned for. A widow at 29 with a 6-year-old child and bills that did not pause for grief. And while people like to say loss makes you stronger, what it really does is make you tired in a way that never fully leaves, and I carried that exhaustion with me every day, especially when it came to my family. My mother Carol liked to tell people she helped raise Noah, but the truth was she mostly offered opinions, not support, reminding me constantly that I was doing too much, that I looked worn down, that Noah deserved stability, and my father, James, would sit quietly beside her, nodding as if agreement were a virtue instead of a failure to speak up, while my older brother Kyle and his wife Brenda lived comfortably 2 towns over, stopping by just often enough to comment on my apartment, my schedule, my parenting, always with that careful tone that pretended concern while measuring weakness. They said things like, "You cannot keep this pace forever, and Noah needs more than survival, and maybe you should let family step in more." And after a while, when you hear something often enough, you start to wonder if maybe you are the problem, even when you are the one doing all the work. I did not tell them how many nights I sat in my car after work, hands on the steering wheel, just breathing before I went inside, because I knew once I opened that door, I had to be steady again. I had to be a mother, not a woman who wanted to scream at the unfairness of it all. And I especially did not tell them how much effort it took to keep Noah calm when his asthma flared. How I watched his chest rise and fall in the dark, counting breaths, the way I counted everything now, minutes, dollars, pills, because that vulnerability felt dangerous around people who seemed to be waiting for proof that I could not handle my life. When Carol suggested the camping trip, she framed it as a gift, fresh air for Noah, a break for me, time together as a family, and even though something in me resisted, even though my instincts whispered that I was being pushed towards something I did not fully understand, I said yes because I wanted to believe that family meant safety, that blood meant loyalty, that the people who watched me grow up would not choose to harm my child, and because saying no all the time is its own kind of loneliness, especially when you are tired of carrying everything alone. I packed carefully made lists, checked Noah's inhaler twice, folded his hoodie the way he liked it, and told myself this was just a weekend, just a pause. Not the moment my life would split into before and after, and if I sound foolish now for believing that it is because hindsight is always crueler than fear, and at the time I was just a mother trying to give her son one peaceful memory, never imagining that the people I trusted most were already planning how to take something away from me. Looking back now, the signs were always there, threaded quietly through conversations that sounded reasonable on the surface, but left me feeling smaller every time. Because the foster family had mastered the art of concern that cuts, and my mother Carol was its most skilled practitioner, the kind of woman who never raised her voice, never used harsh words, but could dismantle your confidence with a single sentence delivered gently over coffee, telling me I looked tired in a way that suggested failure, not fatigue. Asking whether Noah was still wheezing at night with a tone that implied neglect, and reminding me how hard it must be for a child to grow up without a father, as if I needed help remembering that loss. My father, James, rarely spoke, but his silence always landed on the side of whoever spoke last, which was usually Carol, and that silence taught me something dangerous, that disagreement would leave me alone, that keeping the peace mattered more than telling the truth, while my brother Kyle filled the space between them with certainty, talking about plans, stability, and resources, dropping phrases like long-term thinking and best interests, as if my life were a case study and not something I lived every day. His wife Brenda was more direct, smiling as she asked pointed questions about my finances, my hours, my insurance, once even remarking that Noah seemed anxious for a child his age, then quickly adding that she only noticed because she cared so much, and every comment stacked on top of the last until I felt like I was being evaluated rather than supported. They never said I was a bad mother. Not once. They did not need to, because they said everything around it instead, that I was overwhelmed, that grief clouds, judgment, that exhaustion makes people reckless. And after my husband died, those words followed me like a shadow. Because when you are already afraid of failing your child, it does not take much for someone else to convince you that you are close to it. The camping trip came up during one of those conversations framed as a solution rather than a suggestion, fresh air for Noah's lungs, space for me to clear my head, family time without distractions. And Carol emphasized how responsible Kyle had been in organizing everything. How Brenda had researched safe campsites, how James had checked the weather, and the more she spoke, the more it sounded like a plan already in motion, one that did not require my full agreement so much as my compliance. When I hesitated, Kyle laughed softly and told me I worried too much, that sometimes you had to trust family to step in when you could not do everything yourself. And Brenda added that Noah deserved more than watching me come home exhausted every night. And that was the moment something twisted in my chest, because they were not wrong about how hard my life was, but they were wrong about why. And instead of offering help that would lighten my load, they were pointing to my struggle as evidence that I should loosen my grip. I remember the way Carol touched my arm, then her fingers light but firm, and said she just wanted what was best for her grandson. A phrase that sounded loving until I realized it placed her above me, positioned her judgment over my instincts, and I told myself I was being sensitive, that grief had sharpened my reactions, because that is what happens when you are surrounded by people who speak softly while taking something from you. By the time we left for the trip, I felt a quiet pressure I could not name, as if I were being guided rather than invited, and I ignored it because I wanted to believe that family concern did not come with conditions, that love did not require surrender, and that the people smiling at me across the table would never decide without telling me that my child would be better off without me. In the days leading up to the trip, my body knew something my mind kept trying to silence, because every time I paused long enough to think, a low unease settled behind my ribs. Not fear exactly, but the sense of being watched by people who already believed they understood me better than I understood myself. And instead of listening to that instinct, I did what I had learned to do my whole life. I explained it away. It started with small things that could all be justified if you wanted to be generous, like the email from my bank telling me my password had been changed, which I assumed was a routine security update, until I realized it had been reset using my mother's old mailing address, an address I had not lived at in over a decade. And when I called customer service, the representative told me the change had been authorized over the phone after someone correctly answered my security questions, questions only my family would know. And when I mentioned it to Carol, she waved it off with a laugh and said she must have mixed up her paperwork while helping James refinance the house, telling me not to jump to conclusions because stress makes people paranoid. A day later, I noticed Noah's insurance folder had been moved from my filing drawer to the kitchen table open, certain pages marked with sticky notes in Brenda's handwriting, and when I asked why she had been going through my documents, she smiled and said she was just making copies in case of emergencies, because you never know what could happen on a trip like this. And that phrase lingered in my mind longer than it should have, because it sounded less like concern and more like preparation. Kyle called that same evening and asked casual questions about my work schedule for the following week, whether I had any shifts I could not miss, whether anyone depended on me being available. And when I asked why it mattered, he said it was just good to know everyone's availability because families should coordinate better, and again, I let it go because none of these moments were dramatic enough to confront on their own. And when you live with constant exhaustion, you do not go looking for fights you are not sure you can win. Even Noah sensed the tension, asking me why Grandma kept asking if he liked staying at Uncle Kyle's house, why Aunt Brenda kept telling him how quiet their neighborhood was, how close the hospital was, how kids there slept better at night, and I told him they were just being kind because the alternative that they were planting ideas in my child's mind was something I was not ready to face. The night before we left, Carol came over under the pretense of helping me pack, and she watched me fold Noah's clothes with an intensity that made my skin prickle, correcting the way I packed his jacket, reminding me to bring his medical records, suggesting I leave some things behind to travel lighter. And when I hesitated over his inhaler, she told me not to worry, that she had packed extras in her car because she always planned ahead, and I remember feeling a flash of relief at that, trusting her without checking a decision that would haunt me later. That same night after everyone left, I sat on the edge of my bed and tried to make sense of the pressure building around me, the way conversations felt like they were closing doors instead of opening them. And I almost called the trip off, almost texted Kyle to say we were not coming. But then I imagined the response, The disappointment disguised as concern, the questions about my stability, the quiet judgment that would follow, and I told myself I was overreacting, that grief had sharpened my suspicion that families do not plan harm, they plan care. I went to sleep, believing that trust was safer than doubt, and when I woke up and loaded Noah into the car the next morning, I had no idea that the people waving us off were already thinking several steps ahead, not about how to protect us, but about how to remove themselves cleanly from the story they were about to create. The morning it happened began so ordinarily that the memory still feels unreal, the kind of calm that only exists before something irreversible, because the campsite was quiet and bright sunlight filtering through tall trees, birds moving overhead, Noah laughing as he kicked leaves near the edge of the clearing, and for a few hours I let myself believe that I had been wrong, that my unease had been nothing more than nerves, that family really did mean safety. And when Carol suggested Noah and I take a short walk down the market trail while the others finished cleaning up breakfast, I did not hesitate because there was no argument, no tension, just her gentle smile and the familiar tone she used when she wanted things to feel settled. Noah held my hand as we walked, asking if we could look for deer, pointing at moss-covered rocks, breathing easily in the cool air, and I remember thinking how good it felt to see him relaxed, how rare that had become. And I told myself this was why I had agreed to come. This was what they meant when they said it would be good for him. We did not go far, no more than a short loop around the bend in the trail, and when we turned back toward the clearing, I could already see that something was wrong, because the space where the cars had been parked looked empty in a way that did not make sense. Too open, too still, and my first thought was that they had moved the vehicles to make room for someone else, that maybe I had misunderstood, but as we stepped closer, that explanation fell apart because everything was gone. The tents were gone. The coolers were gone, the food, the bags, the chairs, the extra blankets, all of it vanished, leaving behind nothing but flattened grass and the picnic table where we had eaten, and for a few seconds I stood there frozen, my mind scrambling for a reasonable explanation, because it is hard to accept betrayal when your brain is still searching for mistakes. Noah squeezed my hand tighter and asked where everyone went, and I opened my mouth to answer him, but before I could speak, I saw the note. It was placed carefully in the center of the table, held down by a smooth stone, not tucked away. Not hidden, but displayed, waiting for me, and the sight of it made my heart begin to pound, because some part of me already knew what it would say. I picked it up slowly, my hands unsteady, and when I read the words, the world seemed to tilt around me. You will be safer without us. This is for the best, and there was no signature. Because there did not need to be one, I knew exactly who wrote it, and the calm certainty of those words cut deeper than any insult ever could. Noah looked up at me, his face confused and scared, and asked if Grandma was mad at us, and in that moment, the full weight of what they had done crashed into me, because this was not an accident, it was not a misunderstanding. It was a decision made while they watched us walk away, while they packed their things, while they drove off knowing exactly where we were. I ran to the edge of the clearing calling their names, searching for any sign that they might be nearby, but the only answer was silence. And when I looked at the ground, I saw tire tracks leading away not toward the main road, but off to the side, deeper into the trees, as if they had gone out of their way to avoid being seen. Panic rose fast, hot, and sharp, but it was cut through by something colder when I checked Noah's backpack and realized his inhaler was gone. Not lost, not forgotten, but missing, and suddenly, every conversation, every comment, every warning I had ignored snapped into focus because they had planned this. Knowing my son's condition, knowing how quickly things could turn dangerous, and I felt a wave of nausea as the truth settled in. They were not just leaving me, they were putting him at risk. Noah started coughing, then a dry, strained sound that made my chest tighten, and I knelt in front of him, forcing myself to stay calm as I searched every pocket again. Every bag, hoping I was wrong, but the space where the inhaler should have been was empty, and as I pulled him into my arms, feeling his small body tense against mine, I understood something that would never leave me. My family had decided that my fear, my grief, my exhaustion made me expendable, and they were willing to gamble with my child's life to prove it. And as the reality of that choice settled over me, I stopped calling their names because I knew then that they were not coming back. Once I accepted that no one was coming back for us, my fear had to be packed away and set aside because panic wastes energy, and energy was something we could not afford to lose. So I did what years in healthcare had trained me to do. I assessed, I prioritized, and I acted. Starting with Noah, whose breathing was still uneven but controlled enough that I knew we had a narrow window before things could worsen. I wrapped him in my jacket, tied the sleeves around his waist to keep the heat in, and guided him toward the tree line, because standing in an open clearing at night would drop our body temperature faster, and hypothermia does not announce itself loudly. It creeps in quietly the same way betrayal does. I told Noah we were going on an adventure, that we were going to camp like explorers, and he nodded because he trusted me completely, a trust so heavy it almost crushed me, and I promised myself I would not let that trust be wasted. We found a shallow dip in the ground shielded by rocks and low branches, and I used my hands to clear away damp leaves, ignoring the ache in my fingers, because the ground pulls heat from the body faster than cold air, and every small decision mattered now. When Noah started coughing again, sharper this time, I held him upright against my chest, coaching him through slow breaths the way I had taught so many patients, counting with him, keeping my voice steady, even as my heart pounded, because if he sensed my fear, his breathing would only worsen. The night pressed in around us, the forest alive with sounds I could not identify. Branches snapping in the distance, the rustle of animals moving unseen, and I forced myself not to imagine teeth or claws because the most immediate danger was not what lurked out there. It was the cold settling into his small body and the asthma tightening his chest. I rationed the water we had left, letting him sip first, then wetting my own lips just enough to keep the dizziness away, and when hunger gnawed at me, I welcomed it because hunger meant my body was still working. Noah asked me if Uncle Kyle knew where we were, and I told him yes because I needed him to believe someone knew, even though I had already accepted that they knew and did not care. When sleep finally came, it was light and broken, my body jerking awake at every sound, my hand always on Noah's back, feeling the rise and fall of his breathing, counting again and again, because numbers gave me something solid to hold on to in the dark. The second day began with stiffness and cold, my joints aching, my head pounding from dehydration, but Noah was still breathing steadily, and that was enough to keep me moving. I followed the slope of the land, knowing water runs downhill, and when I heard the faint sound of a stream, relief washed through me so sharply I had to stop and steady myself because water meant direction, and direction meant the possibility of people. I showed Noah how to scoop water carefully, how to let sediment settle, how to sip slowly to avoid stomach cramps, and I made myself eat nothing so he could have more, telling him I was not hungry because a mother's lies are sometimes the kindest ones. By the time the sun began to dip again, his coughing had returned deeper now, and I could feel the tremor in his body when he leaned against me, and as I pulled him close and prepared for another night on the ground, I understood with painful clarity that this was no longer about finding our way out. It was about buying time. 1 hour, one breath, one decision at a time. Long enough for anyone to notice we were missing, even as the people who should have raised the alarm were already telling a very different story about why we had disappeared. By the third day, exhaustion had stripped away anything inessential, leaving my thoughts sharp and painfully clear, because when your body is pushed to its limits, it stops wasting energy on denial. And that was when I began to see the forest differently, not just as a place we were trapped in, but as a record of choices someone else had already made. Noah walked more slowly now, his steps uneven, his breaths shallow enough that I kept one arm around his shoulders to feel the rhythm of his chest, and every few minutes I had to stop him from pushing himself too hard, because children will try to be brave when they sense fear, and his bravery terrified me. As we followed the stream, I noticed marks in the mud along the bank that did not belong to us, tire impressions too deep to be from a ranger vehicle angled slightly, as if the driver had corrected too fast, and my stomach tightened as I realized these tracks were fresher than they should have been, overlapping our own footprints from earlier that morning. I crouched down, tracing them with my fingers, and felt a chill unrelated to the cold, because this meant someone had driven through this area after we were left, not searching for us, not calling our names, but passing through with purpose. Further along the trail, caught on a low branch, I found a torn piece of fabric, cleanly ripped, not weathered, not old, and when I held it up, my heart sank because it matched the lining of the jacket Brenda had been wearing the day we arrived, the one she kept adjusting as if it bothered her. And I understood then that this was not just abandonment, it was cleanup, a carefully planned exit with no intention of returning. Noah sat down heavily beside the stream and told me his chest hurt again, his voice small, and as I pressed my forehead to his, promising him we would rest, I felt anger begin to burn through the fear because someone had decided this was an acceptable risk, that a child struggling to breathe in the cold was collateral damage in whatever story they were telling about me. We found shelter under a fallen tree that night, and as I wrapped Noah in leaves and branches for insulation, I heard distant engine noise echo faintly through the forest, too far to pinpoint, too brief to chase, but enough to confirm what my instincts had been screaming. They were not gone far away. They were close enough to know what they were doing. The fourth morning brought rain, cold and relentless, soaking through our clothes and turning the ground slick, and as we moved carefully to avoid falling, Noah slipped and cried out, the sound cutting through me because it was not pain so much as exhaustion that broke his voice, and I lifted him onto my back without thinking, ignoring the way my legs shook under the added weight because carrying him was no longer optional. It was near midday when I saw the motel receipt half buried under wet leaves, the paper already soft from rain, but the ink still legible. A cheap roadside place 40 miles from the park, dated the same morning we were left, and the name at the bottom made my hands tremble. Brenda Foster, written in the same looping script I had seen on the sticky notes in my kitchen. I stared at that receipt for a long time, long enough that Noah asked me what it was, and I told him it was proof, even though he could not understand what that meant yet, because in that moment fear gave way to certainty, and certainty is dangerous for people who think they have erased you. They had driven away together, slept in warm beds, eaten breakfast, and signed their names to a paper trail, while my child shivered and gasped for air, and the moral line they had crossed snapped into focus so clearly that it felt like a physical blow. That night, as Noah's breathing grew more labored and I counted his breaths again, I stopped hoping they would come back because I understood something far worse. They believed I would not survive long enough to matter, and the forest with all its silence and cold had become the place where their version of the truth was supposed to end. By the fifth night, the forest no longer felt vast. It felt close, pressing in from every direction as if it were listening, and Noah's body told me what I did not want to admit out loud, that we were running out of time because his skin burned with fever. Even as his hands stayed cold, his breaths shallow and uneven. Each one a quiet negotiation with air that should have come easily to a child his age. I held him against me and tried to cool his forehead with damp leaves, whispering to him about school, about his favorite cartoons, about anything that would keep him anchored to my voice. But there were moments when his eyes drifted unfocused, and those moments terrified me more than the dark ever could. I thought about the emergency room nights when I had watched mothers lose that distant look in their children's eyes and felt a wave of helplessness so strong it nearly knocked me to the ground because I knew exactly what this progression meant and how little margin we had without medication or help. It was during one of those moments when fear had hollowed me out enough to leave only instinct that I made myself look at the situation without illusion, not as a daughter hoping her family would change their minds, but as a mother, evaluating risk, and the truth was brutal and clear. They had left us here, knowing that if Noah's asthma worsened, there would be no rescue, no ambulance, no second chance, and that meant they had decided, consciously or not, that his life was acceptable collateral. That realization did something irreversible inside me because anger replaced disbelief, and anger, unlike fear, can move a body that is nearly spent. I found the cabin just before dusk, tucked back from the stream, its roof sagging one window, broken but standing, and when I pushed the door open, the smell of damp wood and old smoke hit me, followed by something else. Something intentional. On the far wall, written in thick, uneven lines of charcoal, were 2 words that stopped me cold. They knew. I stared at them until my vision blurred, because that message was not for me alone. It was a confession left behind by someone who had come too close to the truth and did not get the chance to finish telling it. I laid Noah down on a pile of dry leaves inside the cabin and wrapped him in every scrap of fabric I could find, tearing my own shirt into strips when I ran out because warmth mattered more than modesty now. And as he drifted in and out of sleep, I sat with my back against the wall and listened to the wind move through the trees, carrying with it the distant echo of engines again, faint but unmistakable. A reminder that the world I had been cut off from was not as far away as it felt. That was when I did something I never imagined I would have to do. I took a piece of broken wood and scratched Noah's name into the floor near where he lay. Not because I believed he would die, but because I needed to face the possibility without letting it paralyze me, because pretending it did not exist would not protect him, and acknowledging it sharpened my resolve to prevent it. I thought about my mother's voice, calm and certain, telling me this was for the best, and I wondered how someone could say those words, knowing they might be the last justification they ever needed. How easy it must have felt to walk away believing the story they told themselves that I was unstable, that Noah would be better off without me, that whatever happened next was not really their fault. As the temperature dropped again and Noah's breathing became a fragile rhythm against my chest, I made a decision that would shape everything that followed. Because if we survived, I would not let this become a private tragedy. I would not let their version of events stand uncontested. I would remember every detail, every track, every receipt, every sound in the dark, and I would hand those details to anyone willing to listen, because the greatest mistake they made was not leaving us in the wild. It was assuming that survival would erase intent. And as I held my son through the longest night of my life, I understood with absolute clarity that whatever they thought they were taking from me, they had underestimated what a mother will become when her child's life is treated as expendable. The morning we were found did not feel like relief. At first, it felt like confusion because by the 6th day, my body had narrowed its focus so completely that hope had become impractical. Something to be managed rather than felt, and when the sound finally reached us low and distant at first, I thought it was another echo of engines meant to torment me, another reminder of how close help could be without ever arriving. It was Noah who noticed it before I did, lifting his head weakly from my shoulder and whispering that the wind sounded different, and when I stepped outside the cabin and saw the faint smear of smoke from the signal fire I had kept alive with shaking hands all night, the noise sharpened into something unmistakable, the rhythmic chop of helicopter blades cutting through the air. I remember standing there frozen, afraid to move in case the sound disappeared, if I acknowledged it afraid to hope too soon, until the trees above us bent and shuddered and the helicopter came into view bright against the gray sky, and only then did my knees give out as the reality hit me. All at once, we had been seen. The rescue team moved quickly, voices calm and practiced asking questions I struggled to answer through a throat tight with emotion. Lifting Noah first, securing him carefully as his eyes fluttered open and closed, and when they took him from my arms, the separation hurt more than I expected, because for days my body had been the only barrier between him and everything else. I followed minutes later, the forest shrinking beneath us as we rose, and as the cabin disappeared from view, I felt a strange sense of finality, like leaving behind a version of myself that had learned something it could never forget. At the hospital, the lights were too bright and the air too clean. The contrast almost painful after days of damp cold and darkness, and when they wheeled Noah away, attaching monitors and oxygen. I stood there, numb, answering questions, mechanically repeating my name, my son's name, our ages, our medical history, until exhaustion finally caught up with me and I sank into a chair beside his bed, watching his chest rise and fall with the help of machines. Relief came in waves, sharp and overwhelming, but it did not last long because before I could fully absorb the fact that my child was alive, 2 men in dark jackets stepped into the room, badges visible. Their expressions serious but controlled, and one of them introduced himself as Special Agent Daniel Wright with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He asked me to confirm my identity again, then asked if I was aware that my family had filed a missing persons report 3 days earlier, and when I nodded, still too tired to question the relevance, he handed me a copy of the document. I scanned it slowly, my brain lagging behind my eyes, and then the words began to register, describing me as emotionally unstable, overwhelmed by grief, prone to poor decision-making, stating that I had taken my son into the wilderness voluntarily and failed to return, implying that whatever happened next was the result of my own actions. My hands started to shake as I read because the language was careful legal constructed to sound concerned while assigning blame, and in that moment, a cold understanding settled over me. They had not just left us to fend for ourselves, they had prepared a story to explain our disappearance, one that framed me as the danger. Agent Wright watched my face closely and asked if I recognized the phrasing, and when I told him my mother often spoke that way about me, his expression tightened almost imperceptibly. He explained that along with the report, my brother Kyle had submitted statements claiming he feared for Noah's safety due to my mental state statements that had triggered an internal review, and as he spoke, the final piece fell into place with a weight that made it hard to breathe. The abandonment was only the first step, the lie was always meant to come after. I looked through the glass at my son, lying unconscious but alive. Wires taped gently to his skin, and I understood that surviving the forest had not ended the danger. It had only moved it into a different room, one with paperwork instead of trees, authority instead of weather and consequences that would last far longer than the cold ever could. The investigation did not begin with shouting or accusations. It began with questions asked quietly by people trained to listen for what was missing as much as what was said, and as I sat beside Noah's hospital bed watching the oxygen steady his breathing, Special Agent Daniel Wright and a woman who introduced herself as Attorney Susan Palmer asked me to walk them through everything from the moment Carol suggested the trip to the moment the helicopter found us, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I did not explain myself. I did not soften my words. I did not protect anyone's feelings because my child was alive by chance, not mercy, and that stripped away whatever loyalty I had been clinging to. As I spoke, I saw the way their expressions shifted, small changes that told me they were hearing more than a worried family narrative they were hearing, planning, preparation, intent. And when I mentioned the missing inhaler, Susan Palmer stopped writing and asked me to repeat that detail slowly because medical necessity changes the moral weight of abandonment, especially when a child is involved. Within hours, the hospital room became a quiet hub of activity nurses coming and going, agents stepping in to clarify timelines, and Susan explaining in a measured voice that my brother Kyle had filed an emergency petition for temporary guardianship of Noah the morning after we disappeared, citing my supposed instability and inability to provide adequate care, and that petition had been supported by sworn statements from my parents and Brenda. Hearing that felt like being struck from behind because while I was rationing water and counting my son's breaths in the dark, they were signing documents designed to take him from me permanently. Agent Wright returned later that evening with more information telling me that GPS data from Kyle's vehicle showed it leaving the park less than 20 minutes after we walked down the trail, not in a panic, not toward the ranger station, but toward a service road rarely used by visitors, and that footage from a gas station 40 miles away showed all four of them together, less than 2 hours later, calm, unhurried, buying coffee and snacks. And as he spoke, I felt something in me settle, because the doubt they had planted for years no longer had room to breathe. The motel receipt I had found in the forest sealed it, matching surveillance footage and credit card records, Brenda's name tying the physical evidence to their movement with a clarity that could not be explained away. And when confronted with this, Brenda's story shifted twice in one interview. First, claiming the receipt was old, then insisting she had stayed behind briefly for unrelated reasons and contradictions like that do not go unnoticed by federal investigators. Carol maintained her composure longer, repeating that she had only been concerned for her grandson, that she believed I needed rest, that everything had been done out of love. But when Susan asked her why the inhaler was removed from Noah's bag, she had no answer, only silence. And silence can be louder than any confession. James tried to distance himself, claiming he had followed Carol's lead, that he did not think things would go this far, but the evidence did not allow for ignorance, because he had signed the guardianship petition and authorized access to my bank account actions that require intention, not confusion. As the hours passed, I realized the most devastating part was not the legal betrayal. It was the ease with which they had all agreed on a version of me that justified their actions. Unstable, overwhelmed, unfit words that had been whispered for years, now elevated into official language, and it became clear that the forest was not the end of their plan. It was the setting for it. Susan explained that federal jurisdiction applied because the abandonment occurred on protected land and involved a minor with a documented medical condition, and that distinction mattered because it shifted this from a family dispute into a criminal investigation, one with consequences they could not manage through polite concern or carefully chosen words. That night, after Noah finally opened his eyes and squeezed my hand weakly, I sat alone in the quiet of the hospital room and understood that my survival had forced a reckoning they never expected because the story they wrote assumed silence, disappearance, and compliance, and instead they were facing evidence scrutiny and a system that does not accept intention, disguised as care, and for the first time since my husband died, I felt something other than exhaustion settle into my bones. Not relief, not victory, but resolve, because I was done being the person they spoke about when I was not in the room, and whatever happened next, it would happen in the open. The courtroom was quieter than I expected, not tense or dramatic the way people imagine trials to be, but heavy with the kind of silence that comes when everyone understands the weight of what is about to be said. And as I sat at the table beside Susan Palmer, my hands folded tightly in my lap, I realized that this room, with its flags and seal and polished wood, was the first place where the truth about my family was not something I had to defend or explain. It was something being examined under light that could not be dimmed. Judge Helen Brooks entered without ceremony, a woman in her mid-60s with a calm, steady presence that immediately commanded attention, and when she looked over the documents in front of her, I felt a strange sense of grounding because she was not interested in feelings or intentions as they had been framed by my family. She was interested in actions and consequences. The prosecution laid out the timeline slowly and methodically, showing how Carol suggested the trip after months of questioning my stability, how Kyle and Brenda coordinated logistics, how my bank access was altered, how insurance documents were copied, how the guardianship petition was drafted in advance, and how the missing persons report was written to establish a narrative of concern rather than culpability. When the GPS data appeared on the screen, tracing their route away from the campsite within minutes of our departure, there was a visible shift in the room because maps do not lie, and neither does time-stamped movement. And when the gas station footage played, showing them together, relaxed buying snacks while my son struggled to breathe in the cold, I heard a murmur ripple through the gallery that was quickly silenced. Susan then addressed the missing inhaler, and when she explained its medical necessity, detailing the risks of withholding it from a child with documented asthma, Judge Brooks leaned forward slightly, her expression sharpening, and asked a single question that cut through every justification that had been offered. Who removed the medication? There was a pause long enough to feel physical, and when Brenda's attorney tried to deflect Judge Brooks, stopped him stating plainly that omission in this context constituted action and that action carried responsibility. Carol was called to speak, and she maintained her familiar composure, at first repeating that she had acted out of love, that she believed I was overwhelmed, that she never intended harm. But as Judge Brooks questioned her directly, asking whether she understood the environmental risks, the lack of communication, the child's medical condition, and the timing of the guardianship filing, Carol's answers grew fragmented, circling back to feelings rather than facts. And facts were what mattered here. Kyle attempted to portray himself as a concerned uncle, but under cross-examination his statements unraveled contradictions stacking until he could no longer keep them straight, and when confronted with the motel receipt, the gas station footage, and the service road route, he went quiet, his confidence dissolving in real time. Judge Brooks listened to everything without interruption, taking notes, asking precise questions, and when she finally spoke, the room stilled completely because her voice carried not anger, but certainty. She stated that what occurred was not a misunderstanding, not poor judgment, and not a family disagreement, but abandonment with intent, compounded by fraud and deliberate misrepresentation, and she emphasized that intent does not require malice. It requires knowledge, and knowledge had been established beyond doubt. She acknowledged the vulnerability of a grieving mother and a medically fragile child, noting that those vulnerabilities had been exploited rather than protected. And then, she said the words that I would replay in my mind for years to come. This court recognizes that the harm here was not hypothetical. It was imminent, and survival does not negate the crime. The sentences followed, each one delivered calmly, clearly, and without theatrics. Kyle receiving a custodial sentence for child endangerment and fraud. Brenda sentenced for conspiracy and false statements. Carol and James losing all custodial and decision-making rights regarding my son and ordered to pay civil damages along with supervised release conditions that acknowledged their role in orchestrating the events. There was no shouting, no dramatic collapse, just the quiet realization spreading across their faces that the authority they had relied on, parental concern, family unity, moral superiority, had no power here. As the gavel came down, I felt a release I had not expected. Not joy, not triumph, but the easing of a weight I had carried alone for too long, because for the first time since this began, someone with the power to name what happened had done so clearly without euphemism, and in doing that had spoken not just for me, but for my son, who would never again have to wonder whether his life was negotiable. The weeks after the trial passed in a strange, quiet blur. Not because life suddenly became easy, but because the constant tension I had lived with for years finally loosened its grip, leaving behind a space I did not yet know how to fill. And as Noah recovered, gaining strength, laughing again, sleeping through the night without wheezing, I realized how much of my energy had been spent bracing for judgment rather than living. We moved out of the apartment near my parents, not in a rush, not in secrecy, but deliberately choosing a small town 2 states away where no one knew our history and no one felt entitled to comment on my parenting, my grief, or my capacity to endure, and for the first time since my husband died, I arranged our lives around peace instead of defense. Noah started school there. Made friends quickly, and one afternoon, weeks after we arrived, he asked me why Grandma and Uncle Kyle never called anymore, and I told him the truth in words a child could carry, that some people make choices that mean they cannot be part of our lives, and that it was not because of him or anything he did, but because adults are responsible for protecting children, and when they fail at that, there are consequences. He accepted that with a quiet nod, the way children often accept truths adults struggle with, and went back to drawing his crayon, moving confidently across the page, and I understood then that the cycle of fear had already begun to break. The letters started arriving not long after, first from Carol, then from James, pages filled with apologies that sounded sincere, until you noticed how often they centered their own pain, their own loss, their own shock at how things had gone so far, and how rarely they acknowledged the specific choices that led us into the forest. And I did not respond, not out of cruelty, but because accountability does not require access, and forgiveness does not require proximity. Kyle tried once through his attorney to request a reduced sentence, citing family reconciliation as a factor, and the request was denied because regret that arrives after exposure is not the same as remorse, and the law, unlike family dynamics, is not moved by late realizations. Brenda's apology came last, handwritten, trembling, admitting she never thought it would turn out this way, and that sentence stayed with me because it revealed the truth more clearly than anything else she wrote. They had not thought about outcomes, only about control, about managing a narrative where they were right and I was wrong, and they never considered that my survival would force them to face the moral cost of their actions. As for me, I returned to work, slowly choosing fewer hours, advocating for my own limits in a way I never had before. And when colleagues asked why I had transferred facilities, I told them simply that my priorities had changed, because sometimes the most radical act is choosing yourself without explanation. Noah's asthma remained, but it was managed now with consistency and care, not anxiety, and every time I watched him run across a playground, lungs full of air, I felt a quiet gratitude that did not need an audience. On one cold evening, months later, I stood on our small porch watching him play in the yard. The light inside our home warm and steady behind me, and I thought about the forest, about the cabin, about the words scratched into the wall. They knew, and I understood them differently now. Not as a warning, but as a line drawn between who deserved to be called family and who did not. My mother had once told me that blood was thicker than water, that family was forever, but standing there listening to my son laugh, I knew the truth was simpler and harder. Family is a choice you earn through protection, through honesty, through showing up when it matters most, and anyone who treats a child's life as expendable forfeits that title no matter how they regret it later. If there is one thing this story taught me, it is that survival is not just about making it through the worst moment. It is about refusing to carry forward the lies that made that moment possible. And as I closed the door behind me and went inside to make dinner, I did so without fear of who might be watching, because the people who once believed they had the right to decide my worth, my stability, and my son's future had lost that power forever, not because I took it from them, but because they gave it away the moment they chose to walk into the woods without us.